tonight is roughly this. I'll go maybe 25, 30 minutes, hopefully max. Paul, roughly 25, 30. And then a bit of Q&A at the end, and hopefully we'll still get you out at a fairly early hour. So we'll get you home before it's too late. Paul and I have been kind of making the rounds this weekend on various fronts, various meetings. We had a Gold Coast, Chermside. I did a video interview with Dave Pello this morning, which was fantastic. Paul hasn't been in every one of the meetings. He's had some poor excuses about being in the hospital with a bad back. I think that's kind of a lame excuse, but that is the case. He actually was yesterday morning in hospital briefly, so do pray for Paul. His back has been giving him some problems, and it's great that he could make it tonight, so we won't overtax him with what he does. And so it's been good, and then tomorrow I'll head back to Melbourne where my family is. So thank you again for coming out. We are going to look briefly at the issue of euthanasia, part of what we call the culture of death. Obviously very dark times in many ways that we live in, the whole spectrum of a cheapening of the value of human life, from cradle to grave, as you know. For those of you who are of a kind of a religious bent, there would be obviously scripture to speak to about this. Proverbs, the very well-known passage about all those who hate me, that is God, love death. So if you love God, you tend to love life. If you hate God, you tend sometimes to hate life. Jesus himself talked about the enemy who comes to kill and to destroy. So we have a lot of passages if you want to move in that direction. In fact, in all of my books, I've divided them all into two halves. The first is the social science data, the kind of the secular arguments. So any non-Christian would be quite happy simply reading the first half of each book, no biblical, theological. But for those who are keen on that side of things, the second half of each book does provide, biblical and theological rationale for what we are talking about. So you can give the book to a non-Christian friend, for example, tell him to read the first half only if he prefers, and a solid case is made without any religious reference. So it can be handy in that sense. Obviously, a lot of fronts, what we could call the unholy trinity, right? We have abortion, infanticide, euthanasia. Those are all being fought in various degrees all around the Western world. Obviously, tonight the focus is on euthanasia, so that's what we will stay with. And as you just heard from Julie, 2 of the 3 bioethics trilogy books are now available. If you hang around long enough, hopefully a little bit later this year, the 3rd will be on IVF and surrogacy. So that'll finish up that trilogy of bioethics books. And then I do have some books coming out on Islam and other things. So there's plenty of issues out there to keep us busy with, or at least me. So we do have a fair amount. So hopefully everybody who may want a copy tonight can get one. So I urge that you do. Same with the video. Great resources in a war of ideas. Information is ammunition. So you need to have the information so you can, make this fight, whether it's with politicians, in the public arena, newspapers, talkback radio, and so on. We need to have the facts and the figures and so on. So hopefully these 3 resources are going to give you pretty much all that you need. In the book, as I say, the first half is the secular arguments. So there's 10 sections that we look at in the first half. So I'll just run through those very quickly. Obviously, when you have legalized euthanasia or assisted suicide, the doctor-patient relationship has to be weakened. Instead of trust, fear can come in when you're not sure if your doctor is there to keep you alive or to maybe help kill you. Whenever you have a right to something, there's a corresponding duty, right? If you get a right to homosexual marriage, which we've been fighting for 20 years now in Australia, once something like that goes through, then there's a corresponding duty for others to make sure it happens, right? So you have to have florists or cake makers or those who rent out reception centers, all being forced to help in the homosexual marriage cause, whether they like it or not. So it's the same here. The most vulnerable will be at risk. It certainly sends out a wrong message as to what medicine is all about. The buzzwords, which we'll look at a smidge more a bit later, autonomy, freedom of choice, self-determination, those words really need to be unpacked and looked at. The whole issue of safeguards, right? All the places that have gone this way have talked about safeguards. We're not going to let it get out of hand. We'll spend a bit more time on that tonight, and we'll see that, in fact, it has gotten out of hand big time. Hard cases make for bad law. When you find a few hard, extreme cases of suffering, sure, we empathize with those people, but it's never good to change all of a nation's laws based on those few cases. Number 8, faulty diagnoses and prognoses. Often doctors get it wrong. You say, look, you got 6 months to live, or, give you a few weeks. And there's so many stories where that simply was not the case. So I have quite a few of those kind of stories in my book. The missing ingredient here, palliative care, that we should be putting our emphasis on. And finally, a very faulty idea of compassion. It's a strange way to show compassion when your idea of helping the sufferer is to kill the sufferer, right? It's a funny kind of compassion. I would think alleviating the suffering and the pain would be our aim, not bumping off the one suffering. So those are the 10 main points I cover in my book. We'll look at some of the overseas situations. Julie mentioned a few of the countries: Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, Canada, Switzerland, and America. A number of the U.S. states have gone down this path. So all of that is pretty carefully discussed in my book, so we can say, look, we've been there, we've done that. We have countries that have gone down this route, so we can learn from them. We don't have to guess anymore. We don't have to wonder what might happen. We now know what happens. So before we go any further, just a very quick kind of introductory message about what exactly is euthanasia. A lot of fuzzy thinking here, so I spend a good amount of time in the book just defining our terms. You have to start there. There's a lot of fuzzy thinking. The other side is quite good at distorting what exactly we're on about here. So if you want it in a nutshell, kind of what we're on about, what we're talking about, I guess this slide would be it. And if you're young and trendy, you'd get your camera out, you'd take a pic, and it's all there for you. Again, it's in the book. But simply stated, euthanasia is not about halting futile treatment, right? We are not talking about going on a third bout of chemo, going on a fourth set of machines and instruments, having tubes hanging all over your body. We're not talking about artificially extending a person's life when they are on the natural course of dying, right? If somebody's on the path of dying, it's fairly clear they're heading in that direction. You make them comfortable, you look after them, you provide great care, but you're not trying to extend artificially that life. That's often the impression the other side tries to give. That's what we're doing. Patients want to die, they've had enough, and we're forcing them to stay alive for years and years. That's not our case, never has been. Euthanasia is not the alleviation of suffering. This is actually what we call palliative care. A lot of euphemisms. Again, Andrew Denton will talk about safe dying, stuff like that. Well, that's palliative care. Euthanasia is killing somebody. There's nothing safe about that avenue. Really, it's a question of intent. What do you want to do? Do you want to hasten the death of somebody, or are you trying to look after somebody in their course of dying? So euthanasia, very simply, whether it's a gun to the head, a lethal injection, you're deliberately intending to hasten the death of a person. Now, opponents of euthanasia, again, we do not advocate unnecessary, unwelcome prolonging of human life. Rather, we're opposed to the deliberate taking of human life, again, by whatever means may be available. So that, in a nutshell, is kind of where we're coming from. We need to have that clarity to proceed in the debate. And if you know your history of medicine, of course, going back 2,500 years ago, the Hippocratic Oath, the whole principle was do no harm, right? That was the whole sum and substance of healthcare, has been for 2.5 millennia. And of course, the Hippocratic Oath took place well before the time of Christ, so a Greek concept, not a religious one as such. And, you know, for years, up until recently, medical schools and their bioethics courses, everybody would have been taught the Hippocratic Oath. However, sadly today, many of your med schools and their bioethics courses, you will get no mention of this whatsoever. So you may have many young doctors, nurses today who wouldn't even have a clue about what this is. So that's part of the, you know, the culture that we live in. What we'll look at, as I said, is one of the 10 sections, namely the slippery slope. And as we will see, it is very slippery indeed. They always say, well, open the door just a little bit, hard cases, end of life, terminal decisions, nothing more, that's all. Invariably, whenever that is legalized, the door gets moved further and further open. And it really becomes open slather. And countries like Holland, Belgium, Switzerland, Canada, the euthanasia laws that were touted as such great safeguards, such great protections, they've all been, well, they're in shambles really, and it's quite scary for those living in those countries. So as we said, despite the talk of safeguards, whenever we find this being legalized, it really gets to be a very worrying trend indeed. We did this interview this morning with David, which will be up online at some point soonish. So if you want to, you know, how would you respond to Andrew Denton, who's become a very strong pro-euthanasia advocate? We spent an hour and a half talking about his recent address to the Canberra Press Gallery. He's kind of given up his comedy and TV life, and now he's a full-time advocate for legalized euthanasia. So he's somebody that you could use as an example of what the other side is doing. And here's a very revealing headline coming from August, late last year. Andrew Denton lashes out at subterranean Catholic force blocking voluntary euthanasia laws. We looked at his talk today, and we kind of dissected all the emotive talk, the straw man, the ad hominem attacks. Well, look, first of all, whether this is good or bad news, I'm not Catholic, right? I'm strongly against legalized euthanasia. Andrew Denton would have you think that only a handful of redneck dinosaur Catholics are the ones who are fighting this push. In fact, in my book, you'll see I quote a lot of non-believers, atheists, secular folks who are certainly very much opposed to legalizing euthanasia. So right away you can see, even from the headline, he's setting up a straw man, which is always easy to knock down, but it doesn't happen to be true. In fact, if we went through this room, I think we'd find quite a mix in terms of religious persuasion. So we'll look at Benelux, as it's known, right? Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, in part because I used to live there. Right, I was there for 5 years in Holland, so I know a bit about what's happening there. And these were among the first countries in the world to go with legal euthanasia. Holland, 2001, passed the bill, came into effect 2002. Very shortly thereafter, Belgium, a few years down the track, Luxembourg. Now, Andrew Denton, if you look at his talks, says he went to Holland, he went to Oregon, he went to Belgium, checked it out carefully. Now, he doesn't tell us how long, how careful, 2 days, 3 days? As I say, I lived there for 5 years, so I might have a slightly different take on what's happening in Holland than what Andrew Denton saw in his very brief tour. And by the way, he only talked to people who were confirming his point of view. He nicely omitted everybody else who had a different point of view. Even though 2002 was the year in Holland that euthanasia was legalized, it was actually a de facto practice for almost 3 decades, going back to easily to the late 80s. So that's when I was living there. And even then, the horror stories of elderly Dutch citizens fleeing to Germany, to Belgium. Why? Because they kept hearing about their friends and loved ones being put down against their will in Holland. I mean, this was before it was legalized. So back then, we were hearing the horror stories. So this is the slippery slope. People who did not even ask to be euthanized, being put down against their will without their consent. So if he simply studied these 3 countries alone, we'd have a lot of horror stories, and my book is filled with horror stories. By the way, the other side is good at using stories, right? Poor, suffering people, all in great pain, horrible. Andrew Denton's father, right, died of a somewhat sad death, and so that kind of spurred him on to do what he's doing. So the other side is good at the sad stories, and we don't discount them. There are real sad stories on occasion. But if you want to play fair, let's swap stories with stories. Let's give the stories on the other side, right? We'll see some of them in a minute. Now, this is interesting. There's a report going back over 20 years ago now called the Rummelink Report, an official Dutch report looking at the situation. And again, this is preceding and then leading up to and then following on from legalization. And they found that, in this case, way back then, over 1,000 patients a year being involuntarily euthanized, right? Not giving their consent, not saying, yes, put me down. So this was a careful government report telling us of the scary figures in Holland at the time. And as one fellow put it, even with the strictest of safeguards, once voluntary euthanasia is legalized, the descent down the slippery slope is inevitable. And again, Belgium, Canada, Switzerland, Oregon, Vermont, California, name your place. That's exactly what's happened. Again, supposed to be only for end of life, terminal illness, nobody else, full consent. Here's just one case. You'll just open your newspapers, and almost on a daily basis, you can get stories like this. Alcoholic father, 41, father of 2, bummed out with life, alcoholic. He was put down in Holland. Was he at the end of life? Was he terminal? Was he suffering greatly? No, he didn't like his alcoholism. So now he's got 2 kids looking for a new dad, right? We could do countless examples of these kind of stories. This is a scary one, a real shocker. A Dutch woman who actually changed her mind, right? At first she said, okay, you can put me down. As is often the case, they later have a change of heart, change of mind. So in this case, a real shocker, actually the family members had to hold her down as the doctor administered the lethal dose. Can you imagine that? The woman saying, no, I don't want to die. And her own family member forcing her down on the table. Here's a Dutch former euthanasia supporter who spoke to a United Kingdom committee being held on this very issue, and he just said, look, I've been there, I've done that. I used to support in Holland legalized euthanasia. So he warned them, and in part he said, we were wrong, terribly wrong. And you can see some of the numbers there, how the numbers shot up, stabilized for a while, and then kept shooting up again. So he tried to warn his colleagues in the UK, you don't want to go down this path. Here's a Belgium doctor, killed a woman for being depressed, and the family was not told about it until the following day. Anybody here like to find out that your parents had been put down the night before and they never bothered to tell you about it? This is becoming a commonplace practice in Belgium, in Holland. Child euthanasia, well, now it's basically up and running in Belgium as in Holland. Belgium GPs killing patients who have not asked to die. Report says thousands have been killed despite being not asking the doctor to do it. And that was a 2015 report in Belgium. 17-year-old, the first case of a minor being put down, right? They always said only end of life, only terminal conditions. Here we have a 17-year-old kid. The number of reasons why is just shocking. One guy had a botched sex change operation. He didn't like that. He was put down. Story after story. After it was legalized in Belgium, 2002, there have been all kinds of reasons. You can see some of them there, including the sex change operation, blindness, and so on. Every one of these laws almost said the same thing. Only terminal, last weeks or days of life. Nobody else. Don't worry, it's not going to happen. There's just a partial list, right, of where we're headed. He was a Tory, right? That's conservative in the UK, a conservative politician saying, well, you know, the best thing we can do for disabled kids, he actually used the word, use the guillotine, let's get rid of them. This was a conservative, so-called UK parliamentarian saying, well, we got to deal with the rising healthcare costs and so on. Let's get rid of the disabled. And they're very open, very frank about some of their intentions. Vermont, a rehab center. This is a shocker, right? This gal, broken wrist. That's all. Came in, had to deal with a broken wrist. As long as she was there, she was being pressured. You ready to go now? You ready to, end it all? I only got a broken wrist, not dead yet. This is the kind of pressure that is constantly being placed on anybody. That is why so many Dutch people, Belgian people, others, they don't even want to go see their GP anymore. They're actually terrified that instead of getting loving treatment, they might get 6 feet under in the casket. So this is real life stories that, again, Andrew Denton, he won't tell you those stories, but they are out there, and my book is full of these kind of stories. Oregon, let's starve to death and refuse to even give water to mentally ill patients. Again, is this terminally ill, last week of life? No, wide open. The door is wide open. So here's a bill in Oregon. By the way, Andrew Denton was telling us, Oregon is a model. It's an absolute model of safeguards, nothing going amiss. And this was last month. The bill is introduced in Oregon. So come on, we call that a slippery slope. Another one, there must be something in drinking water in Oregon. I'm not sure. This is madness here. I think this was a Democrat senator actually said this. When you retire, right, policeman, cop, whatever, we should bump you off. I mean, we got health care costs to deal with, right? You spend more money at the end of life than any other time. How are we going to pay the bills? Well, let's just bump them off. I shouldn't ask, but any retired teachers here? Any retired policemen here? If you are, don't go to Oregon, right? Stay away from there. Those guys got weird stuff in the water, and their slippery slope is very slippery indeed. All right, you're saying, good, I'm glad I don't live in America, Europe, Canada. It's a good thing we're in Australia, eh? Well, actually, the news is not all that hot either, and we haven't gone down the path. Right? I mean, Northern Territory had it a few years. Thankfully, Kevin Andrews and a bunch of us fought like mad. We did overturn that, first and only time. That was great news. Probably Paul was right up there as well, fighting that battle. But we don't have, as a nation, legalized euthanasia. But there's plenty of horror stories that we can share with you. I've got back in my home a little report. It's about this big, put out by what then was called EPAC. Economic Planning Advisory Council, looking at rising healthcare costs, end-of-life costs, very expensive. How are we going to make ends meet? So here was a government report actually suggesting, well, one way to keep the cost down, maybe we should start looking into euthanasia, right? Anything about the terminally ill? Anything about the last week of life? Nope. Let's save some money. We got to save money somewhere. So this was an actual government report. I still got it at home. I should get a picture of that thing. South Australia, where Paul comes from, survey was done. 49% people who have died at the hands of their physicians did not ask to be bumped off. We find this consistently in various surveys. 1,000 Australian surgeons asked. 1/3 had intentionally hastened death. About half of these did so without, again, the parental consent. Another one, 683 general surgeons, Newcastle. 1/3, again, had sped up the death of a patient, and again, roughly half had not even asked for it. So we get too many of these kind of surveys. Here's a story, well, you can read these in detail in the book. A gal, 56, doctor said, for sure, you're up in Darwin, you're not going to make it, you got some real problems. Everybody wrote her off. She was a goner. Thankfully, a cancer specialist came in, did some work. Cancer is now in remission. She woke up stunned after 3 days in a coma, alive and well. Even though all the doctors had said, sorry, you're a goner, no hope, let's, we got to free up the bed. They got more important patients. So these are commonplace stories. They simply got it wrong in their prognosis. You all know, of course, of our own Dr. Death, Philip Nitsky, tirelessly campaigning to legalize euthanasia. He actually said, as you may recall, about 20 years ago now, I think, in an interview, what we need to do is, of course, have suicide pills available in our supermarkets, and anybody, including depressed teenagers, should have access to them. Is that end of life? Is that the last few days of life? Terminal cases only? What did he say? Depressed teenager, get your pills in the supermarket. Right, so you get a loaf of bread, some lettuce and carrots. I don't know what you get at Kohl's or Woolies. You go down the next aisle, you get your suicide pills. You've just broken up with your boyfriend. You're 15 years old. You're bummed out. Great, I'll get a loaf of bread, ham, cheese, make a nice sandwich. I got my pills. After my lunch, I'm going to bump myself off. And that was the urging of Philip Nitsky. And there'd be many more like him making those kind of recommendations. So very quickly, as we finish, we have to look at history. If we don't learn from history, right, we keep repeating its mistakes. So euthanasia was in full swing before the Nazi Holocaust, and in fact, it paved the way for it, right? One of the famous books in the medical scientific community came out in 1920. The English version, The Authorization of the Destruction of Life Unworthy of Life. Right? Some people are not worthy of life, of living. And this was a well-received, popular book at the time, which of course helped to feed the whole Nazi killing machine, right? So all this was done beforehand. Before even Hitler was on the scene, the medical scientific community was preparing the way for the final solution and all the other groups that were mercilessly killed. One American Christian commenting on Germany at the time said this: the sad fact is most Christians in Germany, well, they said nothing. They were swept along with the hysteria of the day. They actually favored the whole movement, which of course became the eugenics movement with the Jews. The few, those who did speak out, of course, many of them didn't get very far. You know about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the Lutheran pastor. Of course, he was killed for speaking out, right? Imprisoned by the Nazis and then killed. One guy who did manage to get through was another pastor, Martin Niemöller. And you may have heard this before, but it's worth repeating because this is where you guys come into the picture, right? Just as some of them back then did not speak up, some of us today are remaining much too quiet in the face of great evil. So in Germany, they first came for the communists. I didn't say anything. I wasn't a communist. Came for the Jews. I didn't speak. I wasn't a Jew. Came for the trade unionists. Nah, I'm not one. Came for the Catholics. Nope, I'm Protestant. Then they came for me. But by that time, right, it was too late. Not enough around to do anything about it. And sadly, I think we're looking at a similar situation here. I mean, I've got a great encouragement to see, 50 people here? Should we have 500, 5,000 people here? This is a life and death issue that we should all be concerned about. So wow down to all of you for coming, but we need to raise the alarm and alert a whole lot more people. So what are we going to do? A lot of things we can do. Got to join the fight back. In a culture of death, we need to get involved, especially in the public arena, every level, politically, socially, culturally. As we said, the war of ideas, you need information. You have to go armed and prepared. So we got books, we got videos, we got organizations, Cherish Life, right? Hope in Adelaide. So plenty of things you can do. Join one of these groups, become a pro-life lobbyist, get in touch with politicians, in fact, support pro-life politicians. be willing to speak out, as Julie said, friends, neighbors, on the train to work, whatever. We all have a role to play to alert one another. I simply share this story because I know the guy. I was in London a few years ago. I met David Williams. He used to be a pro-euthanasia guy. He went through his own crisis, had some amazing issues with a tumor on his spine, somewhat of a miraculous outcome, and now he's working full-time against legalized euthanasia, and he's just had his third child. There he talks about, how much pain he was, how much distress he was, but now he sees how wrong he was to push the euthanasia campaign. So his story and many others like him I have in the book. Here is a MP in Scotland, another gal who you would think would be on side, right, Labour Party MP, but she's one of the many who are very concerned about this. She's disabled as a form of cerebral palsy. So she, of all persons, knows just how risky this is. So she strongly campaigned when they had their debate on this, and thankfully Scotland voted it down, partly because of her testimony and that of others. You can see there, I have a life-shortening condition, probably going to die quite young, lose functions in my body and so on. But, how can I do this? How can I let my condition become a means of which we can say to others like me, well, you're expendable. So she talked about why we cannot pass this bill, and if it does, it's going to have this stereotype increase that the disabled people, they're just a burden on society and they don't contribute anything. We need to get rid of them. So a few thoughts to finish up with. The American ethicist Paul Ramsey put it this way: the conviction that one should always choose life lies at the heart of the practice of medicine and nursing. In that sense, medical ethics must be pro-life. One or two more. American ethicist who's still alive, our task is therefore not to abandon those who suffer, but to maximize care for them as they live out their own story. We ought always to care, never to kill. And it has, in fact, been precisely our deep commitment not to abandon those who suffer that has, in large measure, been a powerful motive force in the development of modern medicine. Our continued task is not to eliminate sufferers, but to find better ways of dealing with their suffering, right? That is what medicine should be doing. Some of you may know Nick, or did. He passed away a couple of years ago now. I've shared many, stages like this with Nick over the decades. Fearless champion for life, for, pro-life on abortion, euthanasia. He too wrote a trilogy on bioethics, much bigger and more important than my trilogy, that's for sure. But the important thing about him is, right, if anybody could make the case for euthanasia, it would be him. He spent most of his life suffering some very hardcore conditions, autoimmune disease. You can read his whole story online, but here's just a fraction of what he's been going through for 40 years, right? I've undergone 15 angioplasty procedures and the placement of 8 stents to attempt to recover some of the blood flow, on and on, the list of, hardships. But to the very end, he was resolute, firm in his conviction about life. He says, I cannot speak for all people who suffer, but I think I can speak a bit more than some, especially those who advocate euthanasia. Facing illness and disability takes courage. And we do not need those euthanasia advocates to tell us that we are so lacking dignity and have such a poor quality of life that our lives are not worth living. So we have to learn from those who have gone before. If we look at a slightly different front, Frederick Douglass was a keen advocate of abolition of the slave trade, a black man himself. Something he said during the time of the Civil War in the U.S., I think it's worth kind of grabbing that spirit and running with it ourselves. It's not light that's needed, but fire, not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced. Now that's passion for a cause, and certainly the closest analogy, I suppose, to the slave trade would be the abortion wars, but we could certainly bring it right into the euthanasia battle as well. So again, a few concluding passages. If you're so inclined, rescue those being led to the slaughter. Speak up for those who cannot speak up for themselves. The third president of the U.S., the chief purpose of government is to protect life. Abandon that and you've abandoned everything, right? Doesn't do any good to talk about social justice if you're not alive, right? So this is the first and most fundamental human right, the right to life. I think we're at the end. We're in a battle, don't have the luxury of sitting on the fence, so thank you so much for coming out. We got to fight on every level. And as one guy said 2,000 years ago, we're called to be salt and light in this kind of battle. Yeah, that's it. That's my website. That's what I do. Thank you very much. Paul will be here, and then a bit of questions at the end. So, thank you.